Europeans use languages and Americans too, but Africans use dialects in a way. So this is kind of a common idea, a colonial idea that is in many people's heads.
Hallo, wir sind das Podcast-Team Friederike Brinker, Tamara Fitztum
und Marco Masur.
Hi there. Today we are talking about the language Kinyarwanda and its varieties with two scholars of African linguistics. Nico Nassenstein from our project Contouring and Blurring of Linguistic Human Differentiation, and John Doldo IV, who worked on a dictionary of Kinyarwanda. As John doesn't speak German, this episode is in English. They were both taking part in the workshop Differentiating Varieties and Their Speakers in April. John has spent more than a year in Rwanda.
Sohne und Solche. Ein Podcast über Menschen und wie sie sich unterscheiden. Und wie die Kulturwissenschaften dazu forschen. Mit dem Sonderforschungsbereich Humandifferenzierung.
Well, I was interested in the political situation, the history of, the genocide and stuff when I first went there, but I found that there's a lot more going on in the country since the genocide, and really took a liking to the place and kept coming back. But also from the first visit, I was very interested in the Rwandan language and wanted to learn to speak it more fluently. It's a pretty difficult language. It's called the booby trap language by one of the foremost linguists who studied it, André Coupé, La Langue Piégée. And there are good reasons for that. It has a lot of neutralizations where one surface phenomenon could be the result of a lot of different underlying processes, and you have to look at it contextually to really know. Mm-hmm. So it was a challenge, and I wanted to try to pick it up.
Could you tell me what is a surface phenomenon?
For instance, different forms of the word, so body or body, there are tonal differences and differences in vowel length. But what I mean is one word can be spelled the same, or it can even be pronounced the same in terms of tonality, but it can mean different things depending on the context.
Oh, okay. Because
there are different morphological processes behind the word.
But that was one of the first questions I wanted to start with. You're focusing on your workshop, and I think in much of your work on Kinyarwanda, which is the national language of Rwanda, but also spoken elsewhere. So where is it spoken? How many speakers are there? And why is it so interesting?
Well, it's spoken in Rwanda. Now, this kind of strays into the question of what is a language, what is the Rwandan language, where are its boundaries. Taken in the most broad sense, I would say that it's spoken in Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, and the Congo, and of course diaspora communities. It's spoken by upwards of 20 million people. It is the most populous Bantu language other than Swahili, as I understand it.
Okay.
And this also already touches upon the complex history of the language, I would say, starting from colonial times, or pre-colonial times, of course, but then the colonial history was a clear cut in the history and historiography of the language in a way, because what in pre-colonial times belonged to the Rwandan Empire or realm was then later cut into different pieces, one could say. So in the Brussels Conference from 1910, for example, the three powers of the region, which were the German Empire by the time, the British Empire, and Belgium. It had just actually passed from the private property, the Congo, Free State of the Congo, private property of the, by then, King Leopold II, to the Belgian colonial state, practically. They sat together and clearly demarcated and shaped the boundaries that we have today in 1910. And that clearly changed politics in the region and also people's belonging, for example, to one nation state, meaning suddenly being Ugandan, being Rwandan, being Congolese, or rather belonging to the British Empire, to the Germans or the Belgians at the time. And I would say until today, this is one of the complex phenomena that come along with the history of Kinyarwanda, but also Kirundi, the very similar language spoken in Burundi, and these varieties that we look at today during the workshop being used also in Uganda and the Congo. And so it is not only a linguistic thing that we look at and are interested in. For sure, it's first of all, these are linguistic phenomena. But then second, there is a clear impact and connection to social phenomena, to political, historical phenomena. And it's an extremely interesting region, as John also already said. And this is also what brought me to the region in the first place in 2010, same year as John came to Uganda, to Rwanda, sorry.
So basically, the languages of Uganda and Rwanda, the difference is just that there's a border in the middle?
Well, one could say there are, of course, many other languages being spoken also in a country like Uganda and the Congo. And Uganda, more than 30, 40, and the Congo more than 200. But there are specific, one could say, varieties or dialects of the Rwandan language that are also used at the national level in Burundi, which is called Kirundi. And no one would say it's a variety of Kinyarwanda. If everyone would say it's a language in its own right, it's Kirundi, the Burundian language. Yeah. Because it's this national idea behind, of course. But in Uganda and the Congo, where these varieties, these cross-border varieties, were at some point cut off or at the periphery of the Rwandan Empire, for example, these are clearly varieties. People may call them differently, may also say, no, this is our language. In Uganda, we call it Rufumbira, for example. Or they may say in North Kivu province of the Congo, the adjacent Congo, may say, this is Ikinyabgisha. It has a specific name, but still it is closely related. You see, you could compare it to English dialects, for example, or to German dialects, and maybe even certain German dialects, if you compare maybe Bavarian dialects with Northern German, are even further away, further apart than some of the varieties of Kinyarwanda or Rwandan.
And does everybody understand each other? Because I'm from the north and I once was in Bavaria, asked for the way somewhere, and I didn't understand a word.
Happens to me too, not only in Bavaria. I would say most people understand each other or understand something 90, maybe between 85 and 95%. So there is, and at least when they accommodate their speech, that means they adapt their speech. They can surely make each other understand what they've just said and to communicate. Communication is very, very possible and is also works well. But sometimes, of course, there may be specific words, there may be specific grammatical forms, there may be specific phonemes that deviate, that are different, and that are very meaningful. We know that from other varieties too, where one change, one deviation suddenly is very emblematic in linguistics, we would say, like means something at a social level, for example, at the identity level. And speakers may perceive this much more prominently than they perceive normal speech, maybe.
And what is the difference between a variety, a language, and a dialect?
Well, this is a complicated question. It's somewhat subjective. In my opinion, a language would encompass a variety of dialects, and a dialect would be something that is not individual, something that is not even tied to a specific social category. It is, an argot, or something that's tied to a profession.
What's an argot?
An argot is something that's tied, say, the speech of blacksmiths in this particular location, or the speech of maybe a school, the way the students communicate and change the language. But it is something that is broader than that. It is maybe regional, or maybe somehow not tied to a specific locality. So a language is often, usually there are subjective associations with the term language and dialect. People say that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. That's not really the way that I approach it. I look at it more in terms of mutual intelligibility and common origin. There, of course, is a high degree of mutual intelligibility between languages where there's a lot of loanwords going from one to the other. That's not the only criterion we can look at. We also have to look at it in terms of genetic origin. So because there's basically a dialect continuum across this region of Central Africa, because each of the names is tied to a specific part of the region, Rwandan, Rundi, Ha, Gisha, and other terms. But this group of dialects constitutes a language. And then within each dialect, there are subdialects. There is more variation. And then there are things that are tied to specific social groups within each of those.
Okay.
Maybe to add something to this, there is a problem with the term dialect if we think of how people may use it in daily life. So I still remember the first classes in African linguistics I took long ago at the University of Cologne with some elderly professors, and they said, well, you may be somewhere invited to a party and people come up again with this idea of dialect. Europeans use languages and Americans too, but Africans use dialects in a way. So this is kind of a common idea, a colonial idea that is in many people's heads up to today, in Germany at least. I'm not sure about other countries, but I could imagine it's similar, that languages of lower prestige or of less functionality, or as some people, I remember certain invitations to embassy parties where people came up exactly with these notions of dialect and language over a glass of champagne or something to me, and said, well, but in these languages there's no grammar, right? So you don't have to do much when you learn it. It's only learning words. If people knew how complex and how exciting many languages worldwide are, and how little languages like German or English or French can play in this arena, maybe, or compete against these languages in terms of what we could call complexity, or also discoveries, linguistic discoveries, and of specific features, then they wouldn't say that. But it's a kind of a popularized colonial stereotype, which dates back to colonial times when, or even pre-colonial times, imperial times, when people looked at and recorded other foreign languages and said, either these are too mixed and gibberish and we don't even know what that is. It's a mixture of everything. People don't know themselves what it is, or it's too complicated to learn. We don't even look at it. It's way too complicated. It's so confusing even to the speakers themselves. These were the two extremes. And this is what kind of manifested itself in people's minds and heads when they speak about non-European languages. No one would doubt that Mandarin or maybe even something like Guarani or whatever is a language. But when it comes to Swahili already, you will be surprised what people will say in a way, or even other African languages in a way.
I will say, with regards to Mandarin and Chinese, actually, there's kind of an opposite conception where Mandarin, Cantonese, and like Wu, Shanghainese, these are all considered dialects in popular parlance, fangyan in Chinese. And it's a bit the opposite, where these are actually separate languages. They're, in terms of writing, they're very similar, but pronunciation, they're very different. They're about as different as different European languages.
Yeah. And one last word to the dialects. Dialects work in relation to each other. So if we look at dialect, we have very often a kind of geographical boundaries, or what we call isoglosses, that distinguish them from neighboring dialects. But also there's a relationship. So speakers of dialect A usually understand speakers of dialect B, and still of dialect C, but not necessarily of dialect D. But D and A are also related, but B and E understand each other, and so on. So you have to see it in relation and how closely or remotely related they are. And yeah, that's, but in terms of the Rwandan language, Kinyarwanda, it's also a complicated matter, also because of the implementation of language in these historical contexts, and also of more recent history. Of course, language also played a role in the genocide against the Tutsi from 1994, for example, stigmatizing language of exclusion, ostracism, specific terminology, which has survived until today. Luckily, in Rwanda, as a very stable, prosperous country, it's not the case anymore that this kind of hate speech is openly used. That dates back to the genocide and much longer, to colonial times. Also, there's a link between colonial language and colonial ideas, starting in German Rwandan times, practically during the First World War, up to the Rwandan genocide of ideas: who came first, who came later, ethnic boundaries, and so on. And in the genocide against the Tutsi of 94, this language was instrumentalized and there was a specific, what we could call register being used, a context-bound speech style used to demarcate the others who should be exterminated and persecuted and so on. And one could think, well, this is maybe a historical phenomenon from the 90s. But if we look at the growing instability in the entire region, especially in Eastern Congo, for example, where very similar ways of labeling and designating people, as it was the case in 94, specific marginalized groups, reproduces itself right now. And this is something many people may not know about or not talk about, something like that. And also here, the role of Kinyarwanda as a language, of the Rwandan language, the prestige of it, and how people see it in the neighboring capital cities, for example, plays a very, very important role in current conflict scenarios too. Mm-hmm. And a threatening role in a way. It's really it's a worrying matter.
Yeah. So you can use also language as kind of like a warning system that some conflicts are escalating?
Language can be used as a tool of intimidation. Of course, we know that if we think of hate speech and other discourses of othering elsewhere, of course. Language is always instrumentalized by states, by governments, by maybe social and societal actors, for example, or people who have power. But in, for example, Eastern Congo nowadays, if you see it as an area where the Rwandan language is also used, we've had populations, Kinyarwanda-speaking populations in Eastern Congo for a very long time. And it's not a recent phenomenon only of refugees, for example, of the 90s or early 2000s or something. But language as used as a marker of debated or contested belonging, of, for example, Congoleseness. Are these people really Congolese by the Congolese authorities? They speak the language of, in terms of from the Congolese perspective, of a problematic political actor in the region and with really problematic political relations currently, and people suffer from that. People are marked as kind of the others whose Congoleseness or Congolite is questioned in a way when they speak this language. And very often it's paired also with not only national ideas, but ethnic ideas, with social and societal ideas, and so on. And so here it can be a threat, can be used, is instrumentalized, and also used in hate speech practices, for example, discourses, but also, of course, people who speak a language organize themselves. How do we communicate that others may not understand? Also, this can, of course, work, that people conceal their speech to hide certain activities or to provide security and safety to their own communities. Also, this is through, we know that worldwide, secret practices, secret language, language manipulation, how children start doing that already at an early age and so on.
And we all had our secret languages, right?
So, and this also plays a role in the region too, due to this politicization. And this is why our work on Kinyarwanda, beyond the linguistic focus, is also something that raises awareness of the recent history in the 90s, the horrible things that happened in Rwanda, and that cannot be forgotten. And the language Kinyarwanda, of course, is inscribed in these events and so on. It is. Things are expressed in Kinyarwanda that you can, I would say, only express in Kinyarwanda, that explain things that happened in a way. But it also marks a lot of very problematic language that was used as the time. And what we witness today may go into the same direction. And this is where also linguists come in, not only historians and sociologists, for example, or anthropologists.
I'm still thinking about what you said, that people will doubt your Congoleseness if you speak a more Rwandan language. Does it also have an impact on how people speak? Like, do they do things to appear more Congolese, or?
Yeah. For example, we've been been both been to the Eastern Congo, North Kivu province a couple of years ago, also for research, also to visit friends and so on. And what I remember, for example, is, and also in the interviews we conducted, it always features quite prominently in there and is mentioned. In public, people are very careful if they use this language. While it's very normal, as you can imagine, in Rwanda, Burundi, to use Kirundi, Kinyarwanda, for example. Even in Uganda, it's not a big deal. But in the Congo, in public spaces, you better be careful, because you don't know what your neighbor will think of you if you're associated with what in the Congo they call, also as a instrumentalized label, Rwandophone. If you're Rwandophone, you may practically not belong there as much as other people belong there.
Oh, okay.
And this is one dimension of our work that comes in at the sociolinguistic level. And it is very interesting, and it is intertwined with this history of the region too.
What is this conflict between Rwanda and Congo?
Well, it's a complicated history, to put it very simply, in terms that maybe reflect more of a Rwandan understanding of the origins of the conflict. After the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, there was an exodus of millions of Rwandans, many of whom had participated in the genocide, others of whom feared retaliation against the Hutu population of Rwanda by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which had just taken power. And these people were in refugee camps near the Rwandan border on what was then the Zairian side of the border. Within these camps, there were organizations formed out of former elements of the Interahamwe militias, the Rwandan armed forces of the overthrown government that had carried out the genocide. And they carried out cross-border attacks for a number of years and were engaged in insurgency, what the Rwandan government would describe as terrorism. And so Rwanda wanted to put an end to this and also bring home that large group of Rwandans who was outside the country to prevent it from becoming a problem in the long term. And so that was the origin of the war. Well, it was part of the origin of the war between Rwanda and Congo. There were a lot of other things that happened. At one point, there were massacres of Tutsi within the Congo, but I won't go too far into that history. It was basically reverberations of the genocide, and that provoked conflict between Rwanda and Zaire, and then later Congo.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to add, in addition to these, large numbers of conflict migrants or refugees, both the perpetrators, but also those, for example, following them into the Congo, also to overthrow by then dictator Mobutu, as a coalition of Ugandans, Rwandans, Burundians, and some other actors too, Congolese, of course. Kabila starting and initiating the regime and presidency of Laurent Désiré Kabila in the late 90s. In addition to that, of course, there were these communities already in Eastern Congo who had been there for, well, historians guess the 17th, 18th century, something like that. For really a long time, Rwandan-speaking populations had been in Eastern Congo, not in the same numbers as, for example, had appeared there and been moved by the Belgians in the 20th century. The Belgians moved what they called les transplantés. They transferred labor, people for manual labor, especially agriculture, from their colony, the former German protectorate or colony of Rwanda-Urundi after the First World War, so in the 20s, 30s. Several hundreds of thousands of people from Rwandan territories, Rwandan colonial territories to the Eastern Congo numbers increased. And they, of course, to some extent mixed with the local population who had already been there as Rwandan speaking individuals as at the periphery of the Rwandan kingdom earlier on. And then new waves of people came that are related to the genocide and to the conflict. And after that, again, more people came and so on. We have different layers of complexity of migration and also of heritage, one could say. And it is very dangerous and impossible to say all these are Rwandans or something, Banyarwanda or something. That is simply not possible. Of course not. I mean, these people have Congolese passports. Surely not all of them, but very many of them and most of them. And so practically, it aggravated the problem. And currently we are in a very complex and complicated situation, I would say, and everybody who deals with the region currently, no matter from which discipline or as a political actor, views this and sees this with some worry and hoping that the strong East African community, which also looks at it, I would say, with some worry, is strong enough to kind of to keep the unity of its member states, of which also the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda, for example, and maybe also to intermediate in a way. And but as we know, I mean, Rwanda after the genocide from 1994 and the liberation of the country has up to today, as we see when we look at the partnership between the Rhineland-Pfalz, Rhineland-Palatinate, and Rwanda. Our university for 40 years already, starting in early 1980s, is a strong and stable actor in this region in terms of economic progress and in terms of political stability too. And now you may have seen it on the soccer jerseys of Bayern Munich now visit Rwanda. Whereas, last year they agreed, I think, to be a sponsor. And now you see soccer players from Bayern Munich even talking about Rwandan words on Instagram, for example, what specific cultural concepts are and so on. And even also, for example, last week's commemoration, Kwibuka, the remembrance of the 1994 genocide, they also kind of send their greetings and respect to express their respect to Rwanda. So we see a lot has been happening, especially in Rwanda, but in the neighboring countries, and especially the Congo, ever since the 90s, for 30 years now, there has been a lot of instability, conflict, and it's not a perspective that we think this will end very soon. And this is also a sad reality of this fascinating region too. And yeah,
I was also curious about, you talk about dialect boundaries, and I was wondering about the boundaries. I mean, we talked about the boundaries of dialects, but what is a special thing if there's a boundary between countries and the dialects that are on each side? Is there a relation, or what is the cultural or aspect of this?
A national boundary of a nation state can be a dialect, can coincide with a dialect boundary, but not necessarily. We know that if we look at Letzteburgisch and Moselfränkisch, for example, or if we look at Limburgisch or Ripuarisch in eastern Belgium and the area around Aachen and so on, if we just look at our front door and the areas that are right here. But this workshop today and tomorrow that we'll be having with also German but also international colleagues and specialists will deal with the northwestern region, specifically the region bordering Uganda and the Congo that we have been speaking about right now. A language affected, and also the dialect boundaries affected very much by migration and social change over the past 30 years, as you can imagine. I mean, we have clarified that already. So a lot has been changing, and the dialect boundaries from 30 years ago or 100 years ago are surely not the same ones anymore due to these changing things. But an interesting case is maybe to talk about Uganda, the border between Uganda and Rwanda. On the Rwandan side, we were in the field in early October and checked these dialect boundaries, driving around, asking people how they pronounce specific words, for example, along the roadside and in restaurants and so on. On the Rwandan side, people use what they and also linguists and their classifications refer to as Ichirera. And Ichirera is practically the local dialect on the Rwandan side. However, there are other designations or labels for it that group it together with a range of dialects in northern Rwanda, and the Ugandans on the other side speak almost the same variety or dialect, what they call Urufumbira. And this Urufumbira, which was the topic of my PhD dissertation a couple of years ago from a sociolinguistic perspective, actually, is very, very similar to Ichirera. It is really, let's say, if you check varieties along the Dutch-German border, where people on one village on the German side and Dutch side speak almost the same thing, same way. And in France, the same, for example. But they label it differently, and people on the Ugandan side are very convinced this is completely different from Ichirera on the other side. We are not Abarera people. We are Bafumbira people, and this has good reasons why this is the case, because ever since the early 20th century, the colonial boundaries, this is what they refer to very often when they tell you about their history, and it makes sense that we are the Bafumbira, and these are the Barera. So if you want to compare us with them, no. They use completely different words, and then they come up maybe with 10 words that are very different, that also someone in Luxembourg will use differently in Letzeburgisch than on the German side, because one uses words from French and the other one from German, for example. You say, okay, but there are also many similarities if you compare it. Yeah, and these people are very different. That's what they always say. They have a completely different mentality. This is why we don't cross. So you see, here it is not a real dialect boundary, but a politicized dialect boundary. Why? On one side, this thing is called Ichirera. On the other side, it's called Urufumbira, for example. And when you ask people, they will say, they're completely convinced, no, we cannot cross to the other side. Sometimes we do for burials, or when a family member is born, we quickly go, or just to the border to see, and then we go back again. But usually we don't cross for fun or to visit the other side.
Even if they have family.
It can happen. We interviewed people, 25 to 30% of the Ugandans on the Ugandan side of the border had never crossed in their entire life. And they live right next to the border. It's like from here to Gonsenheim or Mainz-Gonsenheim or Mainz-Finden.
Okay.
This is, of course, ideological. So sometimes dialect boundaries in the Northwest, and John can surely add up a bit to the region and the dialects, are really linguistic boundaries. But sometimes they are felt, perceived ideological boundaries. And this is also what our research project in the CRC, human differentiation, is about, perceived boundaries. Mm-hmm. Do you feel you are kind of the same person as John Doldo on the other side of the table? No. I may speak a bit similarly, but I'm completely different. I don't even go to see him because we are so different.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to consider is the influence of the standard language on speakers of these dialects. And boundaries are also not always geographic. They can be in terms of, say, age. We found that in, say, Ikinyamurenge, which is one of the varieties spoken in the Congo, and I'll say variety is kind of a neutral term to give to a type of speech that doesn't necessarily label it as a dialect or something else. But in Ikinyamurenge, the elderly speakers maybe exhibit more conservative characteristics, both in terms of pronunciation and in terms of vocabulary and grammar. And you notice that people have spent time maybe in Rwanda or in areas where the standard language is more frequently spoken, or where, or if they've been more exposed to online media in the standard language, this affects the way that they speak. And this can present a challenge to us when we're doing research and we're maybe trying to elicit the characteristics of the real Ikinyamurenge or the real Ichirera you're not always sure at first what variety somebody is speaking to you in, especially because putting somebody in that context of maybe a formal interview, they might want to sound more correct. They might want to speak in the variety that is approved the most. And we mentioned earlier about dialect doesn't the way that we use it as linguists doesn't have a subjective value judgment attached to it. There are terms for that also, acrolect and basilect, which don't imply, of course, that one variety is actually better than the other, but that it's perceived by people in that way.
I'm wondering about what are these interviews like? Is it like you just go to a random person with a sheet of paper and say, hey, we're linguists, please pronounce these words?
Well, we usually prepare some questions in advance. Sometimes we're direct in terms of we tell them what we're looking for and see if they can see what they produce. Maybe we're looking for how do you pronounce this specific word? But that can also bias the responses we get. And so more often than not, we will try to approach it in a more roundabout way. Just tell us about yourself. Tell us, can you speak the real Ichirera? Try and we don't want to hear standard Rwandan. We want to hear the way that you would speak at home, maybe. That's one thing that we'll try and do to prevent them from formalizing their speech. But often we will, when you're paying attention to the way that you speak, you will speak differently. Yeah. And so we want to raise topics with them that will encourage them to produce the words that we're interested in. And maybe we're interested in a word because of its etymology. Maybe it has different forms, like the word for ijisho in Rwandan is very interesting from a morphological and historical perspective. And in some of the dialects, it is pronounced very differently from in the standard. Other times we're looking for unusual sequences of consonants to see how they are pronounced. In Ichinyamurenge, for instance, there is a sound that is sort of like a bz sound, which is a pretty unusual sound, but it's one of the most characteristic things of that dialect. And so we would want maybe to collect a number of tokens or instances of people pronouncing that word who are from that community and pronouncing that sequence in different words and seeing whether they are consistently pronouncing it or whether they maybe go back and forth between it in different similar sounds.
And maybe in addition, what, of course, not only in African linguistics and linguistics generally, but specifically in African linguistics with its dark colonial history, one could say, as a colonial discipline in Germany, for example, beginning in the early 20th, late 19th century, for example, it is very important or essential to include, of course, local colleagues on site. In this case, for example, Rwandan colleagues, and not only as people you may tell about your research, but with whom you exchange ideas, who participate, with whom you collaborate, and so on, which is also one of the main reasons why we are organizing this international workshop today and tomorrow on variation in the Rwandan language, because we also want to exchange ideas with Rwandan linguists. When we are on site in Rwanda, this is what we do the whole time, practically connecting with old friends and colleagues, speaking to people, speaking to government officials. For example, the Inheku Yomucho is the former Rwandan Cultural Heritage Academy, is a very important actor in terms of linguistic and anthropological, social and cultural anthropological work, documenting practices in language, but also investigating present day, what people do as social and cultural practices and linguistic practices and so on. They have people on the ground also, but also in terms of looking, for example, at the old historical manuscripts. And we are right now engaged with the Inheku Yomucho, especially the Deputy Director General, who will also participate today in our workshop digitally, and hopefully soon come to Mainz too. In the digitization of old manuscripts or manuscripts that date back to a couple of decades ago, among them manuscripts by Belgian linguist André Coupé. And so the joint history of linguistics of works produced earlier on, or draft versions and so on, continues up to today. And today it is more than ever important, not as Europeans or Americans or whatever, Westerners alone, to go to African countries and think, well, we'll do it as we did it 80 years or 100 or 120 years ago. No, these times are over. And this is, I think, the ones who have not yet understood that, they maybe picked the wrong profession or something like that, actually. Yeah. But unfortunately, you still have these people too in the field. But
maybe they retire soon?
Maybe they may retire soon, or may already be retired, or maybe not. But it is more than ever important to work on eye level, and also in terms of the system of knowledge that was produced, that is produced. Look at dissemination of research results today and publication, publishing markets, and so on. It is far away from being a fair and accessible system.
So your research is not necessarily available in Rwandan universities, or?
Well, of course, we make sure to share it with colleagues and with students and so on, whoever. But very often, more generally speaking, the research we produce here with an international publisher and so on, there may be some Rwandan universities and colleges and so on that may have access to a publication by the big publishing houses, but others may not. And it may be too expensive to buy a digital bundle of one of these big international publishers for a university, for example, in Rwanda. And this is something that excludes people not only in Rwanda, but in, I would say, at least half of the countries worldwide from the research we produce and that they produce also. Their own colleagues may not be able to read their fellow colleagues' work unless you share it just like that. And so practically, if we work on site with people, it is first of all ethically, I mean, you as an anthropologist also know that very much. But
well, I haven't published anything.
Yeah,
so,
but yeah, I think, but still, in terms of work ethics, it's very similar how you deal with people respectfully, but also how you explain to them what you do. It is if you only take home a few words or a few sentences or a few texts, and they have no clue what you're actually doing on site, you have failed your mission, I would say. So somehow the community should profit from it, but in terms of some Kinyarwanda dialects in Rwanda, there may not be such a community, or the value and evaluation or judgment by this community of their own variety. If I think of my own home dialect in Germany, maybe like, well, I'm not so interested in it. This is also part of the reality, maybe. But then you have to find ways at least to disseminate what you're interested in. And there will be a few Rwandan colleagues, the Deputy Director General, but a bunch of other people too at the University of Rwanda, for example, who are actually interested in. And you can change the system of knowledge production. And you have to, especially when coming from the so-called globalized or global north and conducting research in Central Africa.
So how do you do this? Because if you publish open access, I mean, for you're a university professor, so that might be possible. But if you do your PhD and you have to pay for publishing, it's more expensive. It's maybe not so easy.
Yeah, it is not always possible. And also, if you look at my or our publication, you'll see not everything is open access. Sometimes it is not very easy or not easily possible if you work together with other colleagues, if you work as part of larger book projects or book series and so on. But then, if you can't fully publish open access, for example, and I'm maybe a very good example actually of that, but you can at least see how you include other linguists and speakers and your interlocutors, during research, afterwards, how you discuss and show the results of your work. For example, to the people you have worked with the year before, somewhere in Gisenyi or Kigali and in Rwanda or something like that. And sometimes it can also be very possible, and this is part of research too. We are all free to do what we want to do, and our analysis may differ from one person from the other one. We may have people on site who say, no, the fact that you say in a podcast or in an interview that Ichirera and Urufumbira is almost the same thing, it is so different. And it remains different. And this may be the language board, the language committee from Kisoro in Uganda. Yeah. But this is what science is about. And, but, well, it is, we would say, very important on site to explain to people what you do and employ methods and use methods that are ethically correct. But of course, that doesn't mean that sometimes on a long day, you may be sitting with speakers who are obviously tired and very, very bored because you don't stop eliciting linguistic data. And maybe they're more interested than give a story about last weekend or about their grandmother's marriage or something like that, which is also fine. But it's kind of a negotiation how you do it, I think.
I was wondering about the publications. Is there also, I mean, in Rwanda, people mostly speak English nowadays, so that's not so complicated. But in other countries, do you also translate your work so that the people in that country can understand it?
Well, that's another critical question, I would say, and maybe with a self-critical answer coming along. I would say in most cases, when I think of my own research works, they are held in the former colonial languages, means German and English, and maybe a few things or interview excerpts or something in French and so on. If it makes sense in specific contexts, at least maybe to translate something that is in English, if you have the chance, into French. We are doing this with a book project with a colleague from Ghent, and another one who's in Frankfurt on a grammar sketch of a Congolese language. We are writing the English version right now. We want then translate it to French and disseminate it in the Congo too, but it is still not very common actually.
With regards to publication, returning to the issue of accessibility, I think that one of the big obstacles to the advancement of linguistic science is the lack of access to published, to research, whether it's published or not. This has been a major obstacle for me just in getting an understanding of historical analyses of the Rwandan language. Some of that, I mean, there's a vast literature that's already been written and published on Rwandan, but most of it is pretty hard to find. Sometimes that's because of the kinds of publications that it's published with. It's not open access or it's not easily accessible. Sometimes it's because things were published maybe in the 1970s within Rwanda and never really got any circulation internationally. And maybe even Rwandan linguists do not know all of those, say, theses that were written so many years ago. I think that the role of the Rwandan Cultural Heritage Academy and similar institutions, what they can bring to the table is to help make this kind of information accessible, both domestically and internationally. And also, it's not most Rwandans who speak English, but maybe within the city of Kigali, an increasing number do. But most Rwandans only speak Rwandan. And the Rwandan Cultural Heritage Academy can help popularize the significance of the language in Rwandan culture. Many people will kind of look down on their language because it's not an international language. It's not a language that they can engage with people from other countries with. And it's kind of seen that you have to know a colonial language if you want to get into higher education. But there are people in Rwanda who are working to produce a domestic literature in Rwandan and make science and concepts more accessible to a domestic audience that doesn't speak a colonial language. And part of that also has been the development of neologisms, for instance, for linguistics. So there is a rather elaborate collection of terminology for linguistic terms in Rwandan, which is becoming, it's more and more known among linguists. Of course, and it's used in the school system as well. It's not everybody who gets into it, but for those Rwandans who do want to study linguistics, there's an adequate system of terminology to facilitate that. And there are even there's a 3-volume grammar of Rwandan that's written entirely in Rwandan by Simon Bizimana back in the 1990s.
I was wondering because I think I've been in Rwanda a couple of years ago because I was working in a museum and we did an exhibition. But I learned that I also learned some words of Kinyarwanda, like hello, thank you, but I forgot. That there was a shift in the colonial language that is used from French to English. Do you know why that happened?
Rwanda has 4 official languages currently. Rwandan, French, Swahili, and, of course, Rwandan. Or as it's known in the Constitution, Kinyarwanda. That's now the official name in any language. But the reason for the shift to English, partially you had more people who had spent time in exile due to the political situation before the genocide, who grew up in English-speaking countries. Mm-hmm. So you had many more English speakers coming into Rwanda. Another part of it was, after the genocide. Another part of it is the fact that Rwanda wanted to integrate more with the international economy and English was, and with education, the education system. English was a mechanism for doing that.
Yeah. If you think of the economy, if you think of investments, if you think of its role within the East African community, there was not only English, of course, like with the strong neighbors and also neighbors with whom they have had already good relations by the time, Uganda and Kenya, for example, Tanzania too. I mean, but Swahili also came in then more recently. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's your next question. So I'm not sure. Or it goes into the same direction.
My list has been over a while ago.
Okay. So practically, that's maybe an interesting thing to add here. Practically in the school system, we can speak of something around 2006, maybe something that that English was fully officially implemented. Of course, already by the late 90s, you would notice that a lot of official communication would be rather in English than French if there was a choice. But in the school system, it's implemented since practically the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And you notice, of course, now new generations of young people growing up or having grown up. Then you say that you notice how old you are. That young people who grow up nowadays, they will speak English if they speak a European language or an Indo-European language, and not French mostly, unless in specific family context or a context of migration or whatever. But usually, or very rural context sometimes, but it's really English. And now in the past years, Swahili has also come in, and Swahili has a long history in Rwanda too, ever since at least since the German times in Rwanda, the colonial times, because the communication with the royal court in Rwanda was via Swahili interpreters and scribes and so on, because the Germans came from Tanganyika and later also kind of imposed Swahili in the protectorate Rwanda, Urundi, in schools and so on. And then it had for a long time it was gone, and now it's back there as a 4th official language, neatly tying and linking Swahili, Rwanda to the East African community too. And we have now, as John said, 4 official languages, and with French also in there as the former old official language, because la francophonie plays a central role too. It's not to be neglected. It's not something that's really out of the picture. But the Commonwealth, of course, also does. And so it has changed a lot. But if we see, people were maybe a bit skeptical, even suspicious to say 10 years ago still, and 15 years, and said, will this work? And you notice by the time when you would enter a small shop in Kigali and you would say, hey there, how are you? You didn't always get the reply you would expect. It was hoping for maybe something in any kind of language. Mm-hmm. But nowadays it's different. And so it has worked. It does work actually if you and I think many people, maybe you noticed when you were there, tourists who go to Rwanda notice when they are there. They can communicate with people because very few tourists going there speak French, of course.
Tamara, you also had questions, right, from your friend?
Yeah. So, hello. A friend of mine has also been to Rwanda for a uni project working with schools. And she also talked to me about how the students usually learn English and French and all that. And she has been wondering how that changes the Rwandan language, or how maybe the Rwandan language gets lost because young people don't speak it that much or don't speak it in any academic way.
Well, there's a lot to say about that. I could start by saying that the introduction of colonialism to Rwanda caused profound changes to the language even more than a century ago. For instance, the word kugura and the word which means to buy, and the word kugurisha, which means to sell. The distinction between these two words only emerged with the German colonization. Beforehand, kugura meant to exchange, and it wasn't directional. But ish is a causative infix, so gurisha means to make, buy, which means to sell. Nowadays, with the increasing introduction of, as of course during the colonial period, as French became more widespread, there were changes in terms of adoption of foreign concepts, which took on the form of foreign loanwords, also many Swahili loanwords. But now you'll have code switching very frequently in certain social contexts. People will be speaking in Kinyarwanda, and then they'll switch to English. People, when giving a speech, you can think of the president, Paul Kagame. When he gives speeches, he often jumps back and forth between English and Rwandan. And this has a definite impact on the language. And additionally, you'll have phenomena that even affect the phonology of Rwandan. So you'll have words like guparikinga, which this ng sound doesn't exist in Rwandan in isolation, except as a phoneme, except in these kinds of loanwords, guprintinga, guprintinga. So they'll take English words and turn them into Rwandan words, but making changes, epenthetic vowels, and this sort of thing.
The last example you mentioned, the guprintinga, gukupakinga, gukisinga, whatever, this is a very Ugandan phenomenon too. Through English in the Ugandan language, Luganda, actually, where this gerund ing, English gerund ing is used. It could have been also a contact feature that was brought back maybe with English already to Rwanda. And this example you gave about the kugura, which used to mean exchange, for example, was also brought to Eastern Congo. It's Swahili. It's the same thing practically, where they don't use the normal Swahili kununua to buy, but kuuza, kuuzisha, and so on. And so it's not only about specific words, but what they mean, in which context they were used, in which context they are used today, and this kind of code switching, languaging practice between Kinyarwanda, French, and English was labeled by one Rwandan linguist, Neo Mugabo, I think, as Kinya Franglais. He observed young people at, I think, Kigali Institute of Education or something, recorded data in 2010 or 11, something like that, and said, oh, they really mix all three languages. What is this? And he labeled it Kinya Franglais. After that, people then came up, oh, there's a new language, Kinya. No, it's not a new language. It's a practice, a contextual practice. But it says a lot about what impact former colonial languages or European languages and so on have, of course, on the Rwandan language too.
Conversely, this also goes both ways. Contact with Rwandans has changed English as it's spoken in Rwanda or in the region. And one example of that is, if you want to get your hair cut in Rwanda, you go to the saloon, not to the salon, hair salon. And most hair shops, haircut shops, barber shops in Rwanda are marked saloon. So that one is kind of, I'm curious about the origins of that one. I'm not really sure, but others are just from contact with the Rwandan language, other changes in English. So in Rwandan, when you want to ask somebody's name, you'll ask for amazina, their names. So your first name and your last name are two different names. So your names. So you won't ask what's your name. You'll say what are your names. So Rwandans speaking English will often ask for your names.
Maybe to add one last example to that, very often when people speak about big waters, let's say lakes, but maybe also oceans and so on, and they speak English in Rwanda, they would maybe prefer or tend to use the word lake somehow. So I just came back from fieldwork, not in Rwanda, but in Kenya. And a Rwandan friend with whom we work, Patrick Ndabarishi, came over Easter to the Kenyan coast, and we worked from there. And we were standing facing the Indian Ocean, looking over that. And he's like, "Oh wow, look at this lake." And next to us was the hotel owner who said, "This is not the lake, this is the Indian Ocean." But it has to do with the concept behind, of course, and not with a label for the English label for what a lake is or the sea is or the ocean is, but how people use language in specific contexts. And when they refer to Lake Kivu, of course, it is a lake for sure. So these are examples how English is maybe impacted by underlying conceptualizations of the Rwandan language and vice versa too.
I might give one more example where this can even tie into politics. There was a controversy many years ago over a claim made in Rwanda that French soldiers during the genocide had built a volleyball court on top of a mass grave. I think it was at Murambi in southern Rwanda. And the French government protested and said it wasn't true. And when I looked into the matter, I found that the Rwandan word hejuru, meaning up or above, is kind of tied into the conception of the country as the land of 1,000 hills. So when people say up in Rwanda, they often mean uphill, or above. They mean above on the hill. So when you look at the actual layout of the area that is described, the site of the volleyball court is slightly uphill from the mass grave. And so I suspect that what may have happened is the term hejuru was brought into English as above, when really it's uphill from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there spatialization or language and space comes in, and different frames of reference too. It's very, very interesting. Yeah. You notice that when we speak about language and linguistics of the Rwandan language and others, it's not only always about linguistics. And I think that makes it so exciting and rich that it is always also about all these other matters. You can't do linguistics without looking at the speakers. I mean, this is what we say. There may be other opinions on that, of course, in theoretical, maybe linguistics and so on, or formal semantics or something. But, especially in that region. I mean, and that makes it so interesting and enriching in very many ways. Mm. And I'm very sure the next 2 days here with colleagues discussing variation in Kinyarwanda, the Rwandan language, will also be enriching, hopefully.
Do you have more questions?
One more question. We've been talking about the genocide and how language played a role in the genocide, but what is kind of the other way around? So how did the genocide itself change language in, or maybe Kinyarwanda itself, or language and languages that are spoken in Rwanda?
Mm-hmm. It had a huge impact, not only in terms of terminology. You can imagine that political incidents and things that change everything and really drive a society and a country to the edge of existence in a way, and social cohesion and social organization and structure and so on, and completely break it apart, which was the case in Rwanda with, and of course over several decades, because this is not something that only happened in 94, but started in the late 50s practically. That this changes has a huge impact on how people speak about these things. Think of the NS time, Nazi time in Central Europe or in Europe, and how this brought changes along in the German language in terms of terminology, but also in terms of discourse, how you speak about what has happened or not. This is the same case or a similar case in Rwanda. It had brought political changes also that after the genocide and the liberation of the country, it was and is a top priority to strengthen Rwandan unity and unification and pacification and reconciliation. Not about, it is not and was not about revenge, but about unification of the country. This came along, of course, also with changes that specific divisionist terminology was no longer to be used. And this, in the Rwandan case, for example, and this maybe also for people listening who do not know the context very well, also refers to social and ethnic constructs and constructions of difference that were not only mere ethnic labels, but had to do with the social structure and fabric of the country. And the colonial history played a very important and strong role into that, and also in planting a seed, what happened much later and up to the 90s, 94. So there's specific language that is no longer to be used, and also specific terms which are tied to the genocide and to very divisionist ideas of people who try to drive people apart and parts of the society, for example. But then there's also, of course, language, and there are two articles written by, I think, Mugiraneza, I think. She has written about the language of the genocide, the terminology of the genocide, in terms of metaphors being used. I can give you one example, not complicated to mention it. Gukora, to work. People were called to go to work in Rwanda in 1994, and the work wrote blogs where people were systematically stopped and killed, for example. And there are very, very many other terms. And it's important to raise awareness here, because some of these metaphors will not simply go away or not be used anymore. They have stayed in people's minds and people's memory, of course, of survivors. Absolutely. They are still there, and people use them still for specific purposes and instrumentalization, of course, like extremists, for example. Extremists, terrorists, whatever you would call them, also beyond the national borders, who still target the same group of the population and who still have the same ideas. And there's a whole vocabulary somehow. So these things were heavily affected, of course, and these are things that no one would use them as such, because it is clear they have this very, very strong connotation. This is genocide language. But for example, in the many memorials throughout Rwanda, these important memorial sites of commemoration, as in Gisozi and Kigali, for example, on the information boards, of course, these things are there. You will read about the history of what happened in 94 and before, and people who know nothing and come there, tourists to Rwanda, for example, must be informed. So also the language, and also these, what they call the 10 Commandments, an extremist manifesto compiled in the 1950s, which also contributed to the specific pogroms and later to the genocide, and kind of also helped to brainwash people who maybe before were not involved. You can read about these things there. It's important, but I also understand it is complicated to be somewhere between things that are taboo, ethically taboo, that can't be said. Traumatized people cannot speak about these things. You cannot, in public, just over a coffee, speak about them. Between this thin line between taboo language as something that, for example, re-traumatizes people, politically difficult language or abolished language, these terms are not to be used. Think of the German case. There are very many things people cannot say in Germany, and this is okay and correct that this is important. But then also you have to inform people. You have to speak about what has happened. It's language here is more complex and complicated, and language use and application than one may think. So it's a very good question.
I also, to completely change the topic after ending on a very, depressing note, I recently noticed that on Spotify, you can also ask listeners questions. Is there anything you would like to know from the listeners?
I would say I would be interested what the listeners know about the languages of the region. Not necessarily only maybe Rwandan or Kinyarwanda, but what their conception, their idea is about the linguistic landscapes or the multilingual scenario in the Great Lakes region, for example, or
if they know anything at all.
If they know anything at all, exactly. Because if we look at the curriculum in school here, there's nothing. There's not much. Also,
before I worked in the museum where I started working on Rwandan handicraft, I knew nothing about the region.
Yeah,
it's like
so that's one question I would ask, and then of course I would be interested, because we move in our circles very much of research and academia, and we travel, of course, to Rwanda and the Great Lakes region a lot. I would be interested who among you, as the listeners, has been already to Rwanda and for what purpose? Is it tourism? For example, this Visit Rwanda is everywhere now, that you can see it in football and beyond. What do people go for to Rwanda? I doubt it's only the gorilla trekking.
It's also too expensive.
It's very expensive.
I've been to Rwanda twice. I have not seen the gorillas.
Me neither. I was in this very area on the foot of the volcanoes for research in Kisoro in Uganda, and then I have never done it. But it's often what you have around yourself. You don't do very often. I mean, but these are two questions. Why have you been to those who have been to Rwanda? Why? What for? And what do you know about the languages of the region? I would be interested.
Okay.
I would be curious if any listeners have either tried studying Rwandan or have tried studying any other African language. What motivated you to do that, and what obstacles did you face?